So here's an example of a settlement statement that was sent to me for one of my deals that I use. So here's an example of a settlement statement from one of my recent. Uh, so here's an example of a settlement. Here's an example of a settlement statement from a previous deal that I. Ugh. Here's an example of a settlement statement for one of my previous deals. So as we look into this settlement statement, we got a lot of different sections here. So the top section is the closing attorney information, their address, phone number, all that stuff. In this middle section here, you have information regarding the property, the buyer, the seller, any potential lenders, settlement date, disbursement date, all these different things, the file number, all these different things. So just general information regarding the property as far as the property address, who's the buyer, who's the seller, and all those different things. Now we get into the actual number part of the settlement statement. So you have two sides, well, three sections. You have the seller section on this side. You have the middle section, which is going to be identifying certain things that need to be paid for, or um, uh, so here's an example of a settlement statement from a previous deal that I've closed. So the settlement statement is broken down into a few different parts, right? You have the top section here, which is going to house the information of the closing attorney. You're going to have this section here, which is going to house information such as the file number, who the attorney was that prepared this transaction, the property address, the buyer's information, the seller's information, if there's a potential lender on this deal, the settlement date, and the disbursement date. Settlement date is basically the closing date. Disbursement date is basically the date that the funds were dispersed, which is usually the same. Then you have this section here, which is going to be divided into three different sections. So you have the seller section over here. Then you have the middle section, which is going to be showing and identifying what charges for what are the uh, so here's an example of a settlement statement from one of my recently closed deals. Uh, Here's an example of a settlement statement from a previously closed deal. Now, as we look into the settlement statement, one thing I want to note is that not all settlement statements will look the same. They're going to be different depending on the closing attorney that you or title company that you use, but they all house the same information. Sometimes it's on multiple sheets, sometimes it's on one sheet, but it really just depends. And this is an example from an assignment transaction, not a double close, but an assignment. So in this example, the sheet is broken into different sections, right? You have the top section. This is going to house the closing attorney or title company's information. This section here is going to house the information on the property, such as the file number for this deal, when it was prepared, who was the attorney that prepared it, the property address, the buyer, the seller, a possible lender, if there's a lender on the deal, the settlement date, and the disbursement date. Settlement date is basically the closing day. Disbursement date is pretty much the day that the funds were dispersed, which is usually the same. And then you have this section here, which is divided into three parts. You have the seller part, you have the buyer part over here, and then in the middle, you have the charges or the itemized list of what costs what or what the fees are. Okay. So as we go into that, and then we go to the bottom, you have the same thing. You have the seller side, the buyer side, and then the totals in that area. Then as we go to the bottom, you have the seller side, the buyer side. Start over. Can't move it. Here's an example from a settlement statement from a deal. Here's an example of an here is an this is an example of a settlement statement from a previously closed deal. This is an example of a settlement statement from one of my previous This is an example of a settlement statement from one of my previously closed deals. So as we look into this settlement statement, one thing I want to identify and note is that not all settlement statements will look the same. Depending on the closing attorney or title company, they will have different formats, but all of the information housed on these documents are going to be exactly the same. It might be in a different format or whatever the case may be. But in this example, particularly, is broken up into different sections, which is pretty much easy to read. So we have the top section here, which is going to house the information of the closing attorney or title company. This middle section here is going to have information such as the property address, the buyer name, the seller name, if there is a possible lender on the deal, the settlement date, and the disbursement date. Settlement date is pretty much the closing date. The disbursement date is pretty much the day that the funds were dispersed to everyone, right? Then you have the bottom section of the document here, which is broken up into three different parts. You have the seller side right here. You have the itemized list of charges or what is being charged for what. Then you have the buyer side on this end. And then at the bottom, you have the totals. So we're going to go through this line by line just so you can identify and understand what all this stuff means. So when you look at let's start with the seller side. When you look at the seller side, you're going to see a column for debit and credit. A debit means this money is being deducted. Okay. A credit, this means the money is being added. So as we go down the list, we're going to go down the list as they come around. So we're going to start from the seller side, right? On the seller side, you're going to see two columns, one being the debit and the other one being a credit. A debit means money is being deducted. A credit means money is being added to that seller's total. All right. So we're going to go through the list and go through it as we see fit. So we're going to go through the list line by line and talk about the numbers and talk about what's being charged. So right here we have a credit of $97,272. That is the sales price of the property. Okay. So that's being credited to the seller, which means that's being added to the seller, right? But out of that, you're going to have debits, which are deductions, which is going to give that seller their net amount that they'll be walking away from. So now as we go through the line, then you have a debit or deduction for $93.79. That's taxes, right? Taxes from the beginning of the year until the day that the property sold. That's what the seller has to pay for, and that's what the seller is responsible for if they haven't paid them in full for the entire year. If they have paid the taxes in full for the entire year, then they will be credited back the difference that they paid, right? So once again, taxes are going to be a debit from the day from the beginning of the year to the day that the property sold, unless the seller paid the taxes in full, which would then be a credit to the seller. Now we're going to go down here to the next line and we have payoffs. Payoff to PNC Bank, which is $86,447.87. Basically, that's the remaining mortgage balance for this particular property. In order to close the deal, the amount that you offer to the seller has to be more than that payoff amount so that the seller does not have to come to the closing table with cash to close the deal. All right. And they can walk away with some money in the pocket. So that's a debit. So that's going to be a deduction from the actual total sales price of the property. Now we go into $75 deduction for a seller post closing fee to the attorney. That's just the attorney fees that they charge for whatever. You never know. Then you have another debit or deduction of $785.44 for a water bill balance. So this was an unpaid water bill that the seller had over the course of who knows how long. So they have to pay that off as well, which was essentially a small lien on the property. And now we have all of our debits and we have our credit, right? So now we're going to go into the total. So the total here, we have the total debits, which is the total amount of deductions totaled up to $87,402.10, right? And we have our total credit, which is $97,272 from the sales price of the property. Now you subtract the debit from the credit, right? The deductions from the credit, and we're going to get $9,869.90, which is due to the seller. So this means this is the amount that the seller will be walking away with at closing in form of a wire or a check. So the difference between the total debit and the deductions and the total credit, which is going to be the due to seller amount. All right. And then obviously the bottom line here, this is just going to be the total to make sure that it balances out. And that's the seller side. Now we're going to go over to the buyer side. Mind you, the seller wasn't responsible for any closing costs or anything like that, so that's going to be handled on the buyer side of the settlement statement. So now, same thing with the buyer. We have a debit column and a credit column. Deduction, debit, credit is an addition, essentially. So from the buyer is going to be a deduction of $97,272 because that's the sales price of the property, right? Then we're going to have a credit of $2,000, which is the deposit or the earnest money deposit, right? That's from the buyer. Then we're going to have a credit of taxes for $93.79, which essentially balances out because it's a debit on the seller side, so they cancel out. So that means the buyer isn't responsible for the taxes from the beginning of the year till the day that it's sold. That's why it's marked down as a credit. But essentially, it balances out and cancels out because it's a debit on the other side. Then we got the recording fees and title fees, which are essentially all of the closing costs. Okay. So you have recording charges of $29.75, and these are all debits, right? These are all deductions from the buyer. You have transfer taxes, which is $97.30. That's transferring the title and all these different things. Then you have title insurance, $494. Then you have a settlement fee, $600. This is what the closing attorney charges to do the transaction, the paperwork. Then you have a title search fee, which is $250. Then you have a tech fee. I don't know what that is, but they charge it, $79. And then you have down here the assignment fee, right, to Property Jet Real Estate Solutions, right, which is $22,728. And then you have in that section all of the totals for the buyer side, right? So the total deductions from the buyer are going to be all of this added up. All of this added up to $121,550.05. Then you have the total credit, which is going to be all of this added up, which is the earnest money deposit and the taxes, to $2,093.79. And you're going to subtract these two numbers, and this is the total amount that the buyer has to pay that's due from the buyer. Okay. So the difference between these two numbers is going to give us $119,456.26. So the buyer has to come to the closing table with this amount. The seller has to get this amount, and the difference of that will be the assignment fee. All right. And there are all the totals at the bottom. And that's pretty much how you read a settlement statement for an assignment transaction. Now, on a double close transaction, it's going to be completely different. It's going to be two settlement statements, one on the A to B side and then one on the B to C side. The A to B side is between you and the seller. The B2C side is between you and the buyer. And those two settlement statements are going to be completely different, and there's not going to be an assignment fee on that settlement statement. So you'll just have to do the math between the total numbers from the buyer, due from the buyer, and the total numbers from the due to the seller section down here on the separate documents. But that's pretty much how you look at a settlement statement. If you found this video helpful, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment below if you have any more questions that or you need clarification on. And I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. And that's pretty much how you read a settlement statement or a HUD statement. I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please like the video, subscribe to the channel for more content. And if you have any questions or need some more clarification, please comment below and I'll make sure to address those questions so you can have a full understanding. But until next time, thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next video.